So we're coming to the last part of chapter 8 of the Gospel of Luke. We actually have been going through the whole Gospel of Luke. And it's a series, as you see on the screen behind me, HuMAnity. We call it HuMAnity, right? The Gospel of Luke. And so open your Bibles to the Gospel of Luke. We're going to kind of jump right in because last week, and we're going to kind of head towards verse 40. That's where we're going to be starting. But last week, we looked at Luke chapter 8, and we saw a couple of miracles that Jesus did. Two of which, one was more of the natural, right? When he calmed the storm on the seas. They were on the Sea of Galilee, and with the word, he calms the storm. So he deals with the actual natural. And then we see him actually deal with the supernatural when he cast out a legion of demons that were, possessing a man. So here we come to, and look at verse 40, and it says, "So it was when Jesus returned that the multitude welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him." So the crowd was still on the other side, kind of in the Capernaum area of the Sea of Galilee, on the other side of the sea where they were. They were in Gadarenes before, and so they were waiting. So that crowd, even though they were waiting for him, they missed out. Like, of course, it was just Jesus and the 12 in the boat when he calmed the storm. And it was just Jesus and his 12 and the few villagers and the people that came that saw the man get hit, the demons casted out of him and everything. So they're there, right? But they're waiting for him. I love that about this crowd because they're always waiting for Jesus. They're always looking for Jesus. They're always coming, like they're relentless, right? And so they are there. And then this is what's interesting because in I want you to see this in verse 41. Luke says, "And behold." I love that word. It's a very good word. It actually means lo, or we don't say those, lo, but it means see. Right? It means like, open your eyes. This is something important. This is important for you to listen up and to open your eyes to see. So Luke, he's seeking to draw his readers into this moment, into these events that we're about to see. And so that should speak to us. We should open our eyes, right? God is seeking to open our eyes tonight. Now, Jesus is going to encounter these couple of individuals. We're going to see two main individuals. We're going to see, one is a prominent religious man. He would be well respected in the region. Okay? The other is pretty much a nobody. Pretty much someone who is a social outcast. Someone who, in fact, because of this woman's condition, would be actually religiously contaminated or unclean. Someone that couldn't even touch other people because whoever she comes in contact with would be unclean as well. So if you think about these two individuals, they could not have come from two further apart stratas of their society. One up here, one down here. And yet we're going to see Jesus touch both of their lives and reach them, right? And so it's not really a surprise then when we look at this particular passage that Luke begins this passage by saying, "Behold." Like, imagine, open your eyes to see this moment here. So we need to pay attention as we read. So as we move through this section, we're going to see that these two stories are kind of interwoven, right? So we're just going to read them. We're not going to have an outline to it. We're just going to read it and kind of look at it as the verses unfold. So we'll pick it back up again in verse 41. And again he says, "And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was a ruler of the synagogue. And he fell down at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house." So we're introduced to the first character, man by the name of Jairus. Now, Jairus was, it tells us, a ruler of the synagogue. That means he was somebody important. In the culture and in the religion of the Jews, in that area, he would have been one of the top people in the religion, in the synagogues. He would have been somebody like a senior pastor or or even a head elder or somebody like that. He would have been somebody that everybody would have looked up to and everybody would have respected. But as well, because this is in the area of Capernaum. Now think about this, because this is what started to kind of blow me away. This would have been the same synagogue that, you remember when Jesus went to heal the man with the withered hand. And it tells us, this is back in Luke chapter 6, that the religious leaders, when he did that, were furious with Jesus. In fact, not just furious. It tells us that they actually talked about what they would do to Jesus. They planned, like, how are we going to get this guy? How are we going to get him? How are we going to get rid of him? So think about this, right? These men would have included Jairus. Jairus would have been one of these guys that originally would have been like, yeah, let's get Jesus. What are we going to do about this guy? This guy's a real problem, right? How are we going to take care of him? And yet here we see this once angry man, this person once bent on destroying Jesus, is now coming to Jesus, falling down at his feet. Falling down at Jesus' feet. And not only that, but begging Jesus for help, to even come to his house. Now you think, well, what has taken place? What has happened that would cause this to happen? Well, look at verse 42. It says in that first part, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. She was dying. I think about this. Isn't that happen so often? You know, people that don't like Christianity, they don't like, not so much Jesus, but the idea of Jesus, or what people say about Jesus, or the exclusivity of Jesus. They don't like those kinds of things. In fact, they probably don't like you, because you represent all of that, right? And so they're like, oh, you're a Christian, oh, and they oppose you, and they might even make plans, right, to do things to you, like to ruin your reputation in your neighborhood, or at your workplace, or even within your family. Who knows? You might have that happen within your family, right? Why? Because you represent Christ. John 3:19 says, men love darkness rather than light. That's how people are. And yet, this happens so often, when tragedy strikes, who do they look to? Now, not always, but very, very often. Very often, those very same people who want nothing to do with Jesus or Christianity, right? But when the tragedy strikes their life, who do they go to? They go to you. Why? Because you pray. Why? Because you actually know something, right? You actually know someone. You actually know, you have a connection to someone that can actually do something about their circumstances. It's interesting because Jairus, his name means one whom God enlightens. One whom God enlightens. Think about that, Jairus. Listen, he wasn't enlightened before. He was blind before. He thought he was enlightened. I'm sure he probably did. But it was only in this most severest of circumstances that truly Jairus was now enlightened. He was enlightened. Why was he enlightened? Because he sees that all his religion, right, all his position, maybe even wealth, because he might have been a wealthy guy, all his wealth, all his influence, none of it could help him at this very moment, right? This very moment right now when his daughter was dying. Listen, religion cannot deal with real, serious life and death issues. Cannot. Religion cannot do it. Position cannot do it. Social importance cannot deal with it. Listen, this man's daughter was dying, and it tells us that it was his only daughter. You can imagine, his only daughter. And it tells us that she was 12 years old. I think that's significant, right? Because I have a daughter. She's older now. She's 24. But I remember when she was 12. And 12 is a very special age. It's that age where young girls in their lives, kind of look to their dads as their heroes. They're not quite teenagers yet until they find out their dad, they look to their dads as like zeros. But 12 is still kind of that age where they're like, Dad's the hero. Dad's my idol. Dad's everything. In fact, they might even think, I'm going to marry somebody like my dad. Right? That's the kind of girl this was to Jairus. This was his daughter, 12-year-old daughter. So you can imagine the despair that Jairus was feeling. Oh, what do I do? All this stuff, this religiosity, all this stuff doesn't help me. It can't help me. I'm going to Jesus. That's the only thing I can do. I've seen him work. I've seen him do miracles. Let's go to Jesus. So he goes. He talks to Jesus. And then look at the last part of verse 42. It's a simple statement, but I think it's significant. It says, but as he went, the multitudes thronged him. We'll get to the thronging part. But notice it says, as he went. That was Jesus. As Jesus went. Now think about that. Jesus went with Jairus. Jesus could have been, you? He could have thought, you want me to come with you? After all that you said before, all the things that you thought, all the planning and the scheming to get me, now you want me to come to you? Maybe I should just let you stew in your troubles and your woes. It's kind of like, how the tables have turned. Jesus could have acted like that. He could have done that, but he doesn't. He has compassion on Jairus, and he goes with him. He goes with Jairus. It tells me in Romans 5:8 that God demonstrated his love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Right? And there's another place that says, while we were his enemies, Christ died for us. Right? That's the heart, that's the compassion that God has for us. We're no different than Jairus. We were sinners. We were his enemies. And he died for us. Right? Before we ever came to him, he died for us. That's the love of Jesus. That's the love of Christ. Now, they're headed now towards Jairus' house. And it tells us that the crowd was thronging Jesus. That word throng or thronging, it's a pretty powerful word. It actually means to choke or to press around as to almost suffocate. So this wasn't just kind of like, it's a crowded day at the marketplace, kind of a thing. No, these people were like pressing in. It was stifling. Right? Now, it's at this moment when the crowds are just pressing in on Jesus, and obviously there's Jairus there too with him, and they're just pressing in, and all his disciples. It's at this moment there's a bit of a parenthesis, at least it appears, from our first story, and we're introduced to our second main character, verse 43. Now, a woman having a flow of blood for 12 years, who had spent all her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any. We'll get to what she does, but we're introduced to this woman. It tells us that she has a flow of blood for 12 years. Now, not to get too graphic, but basically she's had a menstrual cycle for 12 years. 12 years, ladies. I'm a man, so this doesn't have as much impact on me, But listen, you understand the physical, the emotional strain that would have been upon this woman that she's had to endure for 12 years. Think about that kind of bleeding. There would have been severe anemia, severe weakness. In fact, the scriptures kind of imply, not just here, but in both Mark and Matthew's gospel, that she basically was crawling to Jesus. Why? Not because she didn't want to be seen. No, because she was so weak. That's all she could do. For 12 years, just in dealing with this issue. Right? So she was just weak and completely debilitated emotionally as well as physically. But then on top of that, we just read in verse 43, she had spent all of her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any. Imagine. She thinking, well, I go to the doctors. They know, they're the experts. They know what to do. No, not a single one of them. All of her livelihood. That means that not only mentally and emotionally and physically, as far as the disease or what she was going through, financially, she was destitute. Complete and utter destitution. And then it gets even worse. Think about this, right? Because she's Jewish. According to Jewish law, we kind of mentioned it earlier, any woman with an issue of blood was unclean. Now, usually it lasts for just a few days, right? But she was unclean for 12 years. 12, I mean, just, it's hard to imagine. 12 years. And not only was she unclean, but the Bible is clear, the law is clear, anyone she touches would also be unclean. So this woman was all alone. She literally was all alone. Powerful, just her. But it tells us in verse 44 that the woman came from behind and touched the border of his garment. Now we'll stop there because I want you to see, because Mark's account as well as Matthew's, it tells us kind of her thinking, her mindset, what was going on. And it tells us she was thinking in her mind, if I could only touch his clothes, I shall be made well. Matthew says, if I could only touch the hem of his garment. Why the hem? Well, the hem because she was crawling up. That's all she could reach, right? She couldn't reach the shoulder. She couldn't reach his waist. She was just trying to reach the hem. That's all I could grab, just the hem. Right? Just touch. If I could just do this. I know Jesus. She's heard about Jesus, right? She's heard about Jesus' power, how he's healed people. But then she's heard about his compassion, right? Like, she probably heard, like, he has who in his band of 12 disciples? A tax collector? He's had compassion on him? Like, this is something different about Jesus, right? And just like Jairus, at that moment of despair, in that moment of just being down and just at the lowest point, she is enlightened. I can go to Jesus, right? The severity of her situation shows her, enlightens her, opens her eyes. Behold, right, that Jesus is the only one that could help her. He's the only one that could help her. Doctors, I'm not against medicine. I go to the doctors. I mean, not often, but doctors are fine, and there's nothing against that. I don't have a problem with that. But Jesus is best, and especially when you think about it symbolically, our lives, because we're diseased, but we're diseased really with the disease of sin. And there's nothing that any doctors or any other professionals could do. The only one that can help us is Jesus. That's the enlightening, right? Jesus is best when it comes to it. He is the true physician, right? So this woman comes crawling through the thronging crowd. It's like, though she was weak and though she was weary, though she was like almost without strength, she said, I have to get there. I got to get there. I'm just going to make it. I'm scratching the ground. I'm crawling. I'm going to get to the hem of his garment. Whatever it takes, I'm going to do it. And then we're told, verse 44 at the end of it, when she touches that clothes, the hem of his garment, immediately her flow of blood stopped. Immediately. I mean, think about this. This woman knew herself. She had been dealing and feeling whatever she was feeling in her body for 12 years. She knew exactly what was going on in her body. And at that moment, she knew something just happened. Something just took place in my body. I know it. Right? So she knew. Right? So it was a miracle. She had been healed. She just knew it. Jesus responds to her, like it responds to the moment. And this verse 45, and he says, who touched me? Now we just said the crowds were thronging Jesus, right? They were just pressing in. So I would imagine like the disciples and all those guys were like going, what? You know, like when Jesus would say that, like, what? Who touched me? Like, everyone was touching you, Jesus. Everyone. You know, this is the reality. But I love verse 45 at the beginning. It says, when all denied it, like, who touched you? You know, like Peter goes on in that verse and says, Master, the multitude strong and press you, and you say, who touched me? I mean, that's like how are we going to figure that one out, right? Like, who are you specifically thinking about? Because everyone pretty much around you is touching you. And yet I love this because Jesus understood the difference between a selfish throng and a touch of faith. He understood the difference. And then verse 46, he goes on to explain to Peter, well, somebody touched me, for I perceived power going out from me. That word power could also be translated, some of your translations, virtue. It's the Greek word dunamos. Dunamis can, it's where we get our word dynamite or dynamic. Right? It's power. Jesus knew something happened. I don't explain how that works. You know, power went out from him and so on. Who knows exactly how that happened? But he knew something had took place. Something had happened. And it's interesting because at that very moment, like it's like I can only just imagine the scene, like the crowd kind of parts, you know, and for the woman, the jig is up, right? You know, she thought she could I just touch him and then get healed and then just go on my merry way and, you know, not really wanting to be seen. But verse 47 says, now when the woman saw that she was not hidden, the same came trembling, falling down before him. And she declared to him in the presence of all the people the reason she had touched him and how she was healed immediately. So she came. It's interesting because it says she came falling down, which tells me before she was crawling, she was healed. Like you see this in other times, you rise and walk, right? So all of a sudden, boom, she's up on her feet now. And of course, once on her feet, she falls at Jesus' feet. She falls down before him. But it tells us she was trembling. Now you think, well, why was she trembling? Was she afraid of Jesus? What was the situation? And there are probably a few explanations that you might say, well, that might be the reason why. I mean, you think about this. She was crawling up through and she was unclean. So that means that every person that was touching her inadvertently was being made unclean. They didn't realize it at the time, but so she probably knew, I'm unclean, you're unclean, I'm making these people unclean, you know, how that might have made her feel. You know, now she's being, you know, like Jesus is bringing her attention. Maybe that's it. Who knows? You know, I can only imagine how she felt. But beyond that, imagine the sensation, right, of having this disease and being sick for 12 years, and then all of a sudden your body's like completely well. I can't imagine that. It'd be overwhelming, right? Just the sensation of it, the idea of it, you know, feeling that feeling could have made you tremble. But then I think this is even more so. Beyond that, when she came to grips with the enlightenment of who Jesus is, that her eyes were opened to see that she was now in the presence of the Lord of glory. This wasn't just another man. This wasn't just another man. No one can do that. No man can do that. This was something beyond that. And so she was trembling. And yet, I love how Jesus gives her that time. He gives her that time, and she just starts sharing. She's telling him, Lord, this is what happened, you know? I had this issue for 12 years. I just said, I'll touch the hem of your garment, and then, you know, boom, all of a sudden I was healed, and it's a miracle, right? Look at Jesus' response to her. He says, verse 48, daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. I love that. You have to see the compassion that Jesus was having. He calls her daughter. Listen, that doesn't just mean daughter, like, oh, daughter, like you're a child. That word means daughter of God. Daughter of God. And it actually can be also translated acceptable to God. Now that is so significant. Think about the compassion that in that statement alone that Jesus had on that woman, right? For 12 years, she has thought of herself and probably even been treated by others as completely unacceptable by God. You are unclean. You are unacceptable. You cannot go to the temple. You cannot even go to the synagogue. You can't even touch anyone else. You are unacceptable to God. That's how she felt for 12 years. And now Jesus speaks to her and says, daughter, acceptable to God. Whew. Think about that. That's how we are. When God touches our lives, that's exactly what happens to us. We were unacceptable to God, and now he has made us acceptable. Think about this. Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5 says, having predestined us to adoption as sons by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. It says, to the praise of the glory of his grace, by which he made us accepted in the beloved. We have been accepted in the beloved, right? That's you and me. Means we were unacceptable. We were unclean before. In our sins and in our trespasses, we were unclean to God. We were unacceptable. And yet, through the touch of Christ, through the blood of Christ, through his touch on our lives, he has now made us acceptable to God. That we can now go, actually it tells us to go into the very presence of the Lord. When Christ died on the cross, it tells us the veil was torn in two, but it was torn from top to bottom because of the earthquake. That's significant, right? Top to bottom means it was torn from God to man. God made a way. God made a way for us as unacceptable beings to be now acceptable in his presence. And now have access, right, to the holiest of holies, access to his throne through prayer at any time that we want, because we are covered and cleansed by the blood of Christ, by what Christ has done for us, what we're going to be celebrating and focusing on tonight. Jesus tells her, your faith has made you well. Now that's, not a name it and claim it kind of a statement. I mean, Jesus isn't basically saying, you're healed because you had an X amount of faith. You had so much faith, so on and so forth. It's not about how much faith she had that made her well. It's who she had the faith in, right? It's not about amount of faith. It's about the object of our faith. That's the case, right? That's what made her well. She trusted in Jesus. And then he says, go in peace. Now, think about this. That statement isn't just like a passing statement like, see you later. No. Go in peace. That's the reality for the very first time in 12 years for this woman. That she could go in peace. That she all of a sudden can go home and go, I'm okay with God. I'm acceptable by God. I've been made whole. I'm no longer unclean. Right? That's an awesome moment. Right? And I said earlier that this moment's kind of a parenthesis, but it's not really a parenthesis, right? It wasn't really like, if you kind of read it as such, you kind of read, well, Jairus, and then all of a sudden, this woman, she kind of, there's a story, it kind of interjects into this, and then all of a sudden, now we're back to Jairus, as if it was just kind of like a happenstance, kind of a thing. No, this wasn't an interruption. This was a divine interruption. Very purposeful, right? You see, because Jairus is going to get some news. And Jairus, his faith needed to be strengthened. Needed to be strengthened like nothing else. So Jairus, he needed to see this woman be healed. He needed to hear her testimony, right? He needed to hear that. He needed to hear that in such a way that he can know, well, this can happen for me. Because look at the very next verse, verse 49. It says, while he was still speaking, while Jesus was telling the woman, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace. They walk up, right, from Jairus' house, and someone from the ruler of the synagogue's house saying to him, your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher. Now, I thought about this. The first thing I noticed, is the contrast. Think about the contrast between what Jesus says, the compassion, that the words that he has for this woman, and the words of these, I don't know who they were, if they were relatives or friends, but they were definitely someone that knew Jairus, that should have had compassion. But they come up to him and said, your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher. Like, just let's get over it, move on, leave him alone, kind of a thing. How uncompassionate, right? They blurted out like it was just nothing. And yet, I think about Jesus. Even though this man, again, was a man who at one time was bent on destroying Jesus, and Jesus could have said, well, I'm sorry, too late. No, he doesn't. He returns to him with words of grace and compassion. Look at verse 50. And when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well. Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well. Again, Jairus had just witnessed this woman who had gone through so much, and yet through faith in Jesus Christ, she saw something miraculous happen to her. And you can only imagine, as they're heading towards the house, as they're, because they had a little ways more to go, that Jairus is just thinking, the woman, think about that woman. I gotta believe. I have to just remember that woman. It can happen for me too. If it happened for her, it can happen for me. I know it can. So they get to the house. Verse 51. He came to the house. He permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and the mother of the girl. And now all wept and mourned for her. But he said, do not weep. She is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. So, interesting. They approached the house, and there are a crowd of mourners outside. You can imagine his house, who knows how big it was, but Jairus was somebody important, so he's going to have a lot of people there, and there was just not enough room probably on the inside, so they're all out standing outside. And he kind of tells them, stay outside, you're not coming in. And we'll talk about exactly why in a moment. So he allows Peter, James, John, of course, the mother and the father, Jairus and his wife, to come on in. And there are more people still on the inside of the house. That was just the outside. And so Peter, James, and John, even the other disciples, they kind of, we want to crowd it in. We want to just kind of keep it low key. But remember, Jesus is training his disciples. So that's one of the reasons why he allows Peter, James, and John in there. And as well, Peter, James, and John are not just going to be leaders of the church, they're going to be the leaders of the leaders. So they need to see these things. They need to experience these things. They need to know that for themselves. And so as he enters in the house, and there's those mourners inside, Jesus seeks to encourage them. They're, do not weep. She's not dead. She's, but sleeping. Encourage them. And yet these mourners, they just reject, if you will, what Jesus has said. Now these mourners, interesting, more than likely, they would have been what would be considered professional mourners. I know that sounds like really, really weird, right? Who would do that? But in those days, the two most important moments in your life, if you will, is your wedding and your funeral. And so at a funeral, you do not want to, it would be kind of like you'd be seen as less important or prominent if you did not have enough people at your funeral to mourn for your lost loved one, right? So you want to be seen as this is important, and this loved one or myself or the family we were cared about. So they would actually hire people to come and be mourners, professional mourners. They would weep and wail and that kind of thing. So I know that sounds crazy, but that's what they would do. And think about Jairus. He was one of the rulers of the synagogues. He was very, very prominent. So he would bound no less to have more professional mourners come and make sure that if something happens and she does die, we're going to have professional mourners, or we're going to really make it a funeral, if you will, to remember, kind of a thing. And so they ridicule, right? They ridicule Jesus, like, oh, Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about, She's not dead. She's only sleeping. Yeah, right. Listen, we are professionals. We know. We've been to dozens, if not hundreds, of funerals. We know what dead people look like, right? You don't know what you're talking about. That kind of a thing. And then in verse 54, it tells us he puts them all outside. I kind of like that, right? All right, get out. I don't know if he said it like that, but and you can say, well, some people would say, kind of health and wealth kind of doctrine, kind of say, well, that's right. You want to have all the negative faith in there, in the room. You want to get that out of the room because otherwise it's going to work against the positive faith, and you want to be able to have that all removed from the situation, kind of thing. Well, let me tell you, I do understand that at times our faith can limit God because James 4:2 says, "You have not because you ask not," right? Or you have not because you ask amiss. I understand that. And so there is an element that we want to believe, right? Want to believe God, want to trust in Him. But that's not what Jesus was doing, right? This isn't about His faith or as much faith as He has. Jesus has all the faith needed to do whatever it is that is needed to be done in this miracle. He knew exactly what was going to happen as well, that this little girl was going to arise. So why did He ask them to leave? Well, I think that one of the reasons is I think they didn't deserve to be in there. They didn't deserve to see this miracle take place. I think that's kind of interesting because people often who reject the possibility of the supernatural, they miss out on seeing miracles of the Lord right before their eyes, right? So it's like, you know what? You don't want to believe. Well, why don't you leave? You can leave and you can just believe what you want to believe, right? So he comes to the little girl, verse 54, he says he took her by the hand and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." Touches her hand. And then verse 55 says, "Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately, and he commanded that she be given something to eat." So again, Jesus touches this lifeless girl, and immediately, life returns into her. And I think that is what a perfect picture of salvation. We've been talking about this, but that's even goes beyond, because we weren't even just diseased. We're lifeless before Christ. We were dead. We were like dead. That's what Ephesians 2:1 says, dead in trespasses and sin. And for us, the moment we come to Christ, the moment we give our life to Jesus, that moment He touches our lifeless spirits and we become alive. A new creature in Christ, alive again unto the Lord. That's the picture here. And I like how Jesus says, "Give her something to eat." What's the reason for that? Well, it might be a couple things. One might be to prove, listen, they might have thought, "Oh, she's a ghost," because they're kind of like Jewish people at that time had a lot of superstitions, right? She's an apparition, she's a ghost. Like, no, give her something to eat. She's a real person. Didn't Jesus do that? Like, when he came and he appeared and he showed himself after his resurrection to the disciples, what was the first things he asked? For something to eat. Ghosts don't eat. Like, give me something to eat. I'll show you I'm real, kind of a thing. I also think, and this is just kind of the way I think about it, you think about if you were the parents, you'd have been freaking out. Like, what do we do now? I don't know what to do. Okay, let me give you a task. Go get her something to eat. Okay, I'll get her something to eat, because it's like just beyond their thinking. They're just in shock, like that this actually happened. So he kind of gives them a little something like practical to do. It's fine. She's good. You're gonna have your daughter for however long. She's alive. And then verse 56, our last verse, it tells us their thoughts, and it says her parents were astonished. But then it says, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. So they were astonished. They were blown away. I'm a parent. So if my child had died and Jesus came and touched them and they raised from the, I would be astonished. That's probably an understatement, right? I would be blown away, to say the least. But I love Jesus' his response, because it's like he's not self-seeking, right? He's not self-promoting. Listen, there will be a moment, there's going to be a time when he is lifted up, right, on the cross. There's going to be a time when the Father will exalt him and raise him and ascend back up to heaven. There's going to be a time for that, but now is not the time. In fact, the Bible says that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve, right? He came to serve. He came to serve man. He came to serve this family. And it wasn't about Jesus. It wasn't about like, oh, look at me. And I think that sometimes we see a lot of these guys on television like, look at my ministry, look at this and that, and so on and so forth. I healed this and I healed. That's not how Jesus operates. That's not what Christ looks like. He's like, you know what? In fact, those people outside that he sent outside, they're probably going to be wondering, maybe he was right. Maybe she was just sleeping. You know, because they didn't want to believe, they didn't want to really believe Jesus, they laughed him to scorn, right? They scorned him. They don't get to really know the miracle, right? They're going to always wonder. They didn't get to see it. His parents, they knew, right? They knew exactly what Jesus did for them. So look, Luke basically starts this account and he says, behold, right? This is going to be a portion that you're going to need to like open your eyes to see what happened. Right? Enlighten. Allow yourself to be enlightened. That's what he was trying to get across to his readers. Right? The greatness of Jesus' power, the greatness of his love and his compassion for all humanity. Certainly, Jesus touched, he enlightened Jairus. He enlightened the woman with the issue of blood. He opened their eyes to see. And further than just even enlightening them, he touched them. He touched them both. He touched their lives in such a way that they'll never be the same. Their lives will never be the same. Right? He helped them to see, right? To behold. You know, when you see something, I was like, oh, I see that. No. Don't you see it? No. Don't you behold? Don't you open your eyes? Open your eyes and see the reality, the greatness of it, the intensity or the immensity of the situation. Right? I want to close with one last passage in 1 John 3:1. And it's another behold scripture. John says this. He says, behold what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. Open your eyes, right? Open your eyes to see the kind of love that God has for us. That not only would he save us, but that he would then make us his very own children. Right? Not just, oh, I'm going to let you in the family, I'm going to let you, live here. No, you're going to be a part of the family. That's the kind of love. That's the kind of thought or idea that John in 1 John is saying, behold, open your eyes, open your mind, open your thoughts to that, right? That we would be called the children of God, something truly to behold. So let's pray.